Hello, my name is Jerron Vale from the Missouri Department of Higher Education and Workforce Development. Our equity project began a little over a year ago with a vision for addressing inequities and educational disparities for Missouri citizens. The department's desire is to build a careful process for addressing inequities and show our commitment toward equitable outcomes for all Missourians aligned with our vision to empower every Missourian with the skills and education needed for success. The Building Bridges series is an informative look at how Missouri's colleges, universities, and community organizations are addressing equity. We hope you learn from these shared experiences, and thank you again for joining us.
All right, we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you all. Thank you everyone for joining us today. Have a few people trickle in. That's all right. We'll go ahead and jump into it. Really appreciate you everyone joining for the February session of Bridges to Success. Got good presentation today. Let me go to the just a couple housekeeping duties as always. Just remember the session is being recorded and we will have the session up on our website soon after the presentation. All attendees should be muted upon entry. If you're not, if you could, please mute yourself so we can get the presenter. And then any questions you have during the presentation, please add them to the chat and we will add the presenter after the presentation is over. What I'd like to introduce today is Dr. Antoinette Boyd. She's the Director of Career Services at Maryville University, and I really appreciate everyone joining the session on higher education, exploring the role of unconscious bias in search committee preparedness in the recruitment and selection phase of faculty and staff. So let's do a quick bio of Dr. Boyd. Antoinette Boyd serves as the Director of Career Success and Professional Development at Maryville University, supporting university-wide career initiatives, establishing partnerships with employers, and leveraging opportunities for students. She is a graduate of Webster University with a Bachelor's of Arts degree in Business and Master's in Business and a Master's of Arts degree in Human Resource Development. Antoinette completed her doctoral studies at Maryville University with research focus on unconscious bias in hiring. She serves on the board of directors for the St. Louis School Business Partnership as a board member for Edward Jones YMCA and on the Workforce Development Committee for Prepare IA. And she is a member of Alpha Kappa Alpha Sorority Incorporated. So with that, I will stop sharing my screen and turn it over to Dr. Boyd. Thank you so much, Dr. Boyd, for joining us today. She's an awesome person. Just had a few minutes to talk with her beforehand. I think this is going to be really cool. She's great person to talk with, great person to engage with. So turn it over to you, Dr. Boyd. Thank you so much for your time.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate having the opportunity to share my research with you all in hopes that it will help you as you are maybe considering diverse hiring initiatives within your own institutions. So what I'll plan to do, just go over a few objectives. What I'll plan to do is to discuss unconscious bias and its impact to the hiring process. After that, I will share some of the findings of my research study. I'll also provide recommendations and actions for improving the hiring process. So if you are engaged in this work currently, provide some takeaways for you to start that process of improving your hiring practices. And then we'll have some time for discussion and Q&A if there's any sort of thoughts or perspectives that you'd like to share or any questions that you have, we will have time for that as well. So the very first thing I'd like to talk to you about is unconscious bias. So just to frame our conversation, what is unconscious bias? It's biases that we aren't aware of. And because we aren't aware of them, they impact all of us. Unfortunately, they have an ability to affect our understanding, actions, and decisions, and ultimately the way that we interact with and perceive others. So as we start thinking about unconscious bias as it relates to the hiring decisions that we're making, a lot of these things are impacted. So understanding, the ability to understand someone and their experiences, even if they don't look like you or their experiences are different than you, the actions and ultimately the decisions that you make. So really just understanding unconscious bias and how it really does impact the way that we're operating and functioning as it relates to search committees. Realizing that even if you're fully engaged in diversity, equity, and inclusiveness, you still can be impacted by bias. So even the most culturally aware individuals are impacted by this. It impacts your ability to logically process factors that you need to make important decisions, specifically hiring decisions, and then it impairs the integrity of the hiring process within organizations. Next, I want to just show you a few examples of how unconscious bias has impacted the hiring process. So this particular study is a study that shows the factors that influence search committee members when they were reviewing curriculum vitaes of candidates, both male and female candidates. So the findings of this study show that the curriculum vitaes that identify with the male name were viewed as more favorable, even when both candidates had the same qualifications. So you can see this study is from 1999. It's pretty dated. So you can see this has been a longstanding problem in hiring, that unconscious bias really creeps into the process and impacts the decisions that people make. Here's another example of unconscious bias in the hiring process. This particular study was a field experiment, was used to test the extent of racial discrimination in the recruitment process. This test involved matching candidates of various races or identities or ethnicities, particularly Black, white, Chinese, and Pakistani, to 987 employment vacancies over an 8-month period. The findings of this particular study show that candidates with names perceived as white were viewed more favorably. So again, just showing you how unconscious bias creeps into the process. Again, none of us are wrong for having these biases, but the problem is when we allow them to impair our decision-making. So now let's talk about some tips for managing bias. So we know that unconscious bias exists, it impacts us all. We see some solid examples of how it can impact our hiring decisions. Well, how do we manage it? This is the most effective way to not allow this to become a part of your hiring decisions, is to learn how to manage it. So the first thing that you need to do is recognize that you have it. None of us are exempt from having these biases. So you have to acknowledge that. Without acknowledging that it exists, it's very hard for you to manage it and do anything about it. So once you've recognized that, you need to really start recognizing where it comes up, right? Are there particular groups or are there particular times in which you're triggered? Your biases really become strong. So it's okay to admit that your biases become really strong if you're, if you're maybe an older experienced professional and you come face to face with a candidate that is younger, more limited experience, different generations, different work styles, right? Maybe different values. Your biases may be very strong against that candidate. So it's okay for you to acknowledge that when there are particular candidates with particular identities, that your biases are strong. Nothing wrong with that. The problem is when you allow that to impact your decision making, to say, well, that candidate is too young, so I don't think they can do the job, without giving them the proper chance to share their skills and qualifications, just as you would any other candidate that maybe your biases are not as strong about. So you have to recognize, and this is more for yourself. You don't have to, broadcast this to everybody, but this is more for yourself of really noticing when your biases are strong against what particular groups, specifically when you're interviewing and making hiring decisions. I like to recommend using memory joggers. So go back to the objectives. Whenever bias creeps in, remember what the objective is there. Don't allow things to get too subjective. When you do that, that's when bias becomes part of your decision making, and we don't want that to be a factor. When you're under pressure and there's uncertainty, unconscious bias is more likely to play a role in your decisions. So really thinking about when you have to make an important hiring decision, right? You might be under a lot of pressure. You might be under a specific timeline. You may even be uncertain about whether that candidate would be a really good candidate for your company or your position. So really try to get yourself out of that space of feeling like you're under pressure so that you can make a better decision without bias. And then recognizing that having this doesn't make you a bad person. There's nothing negative about it. The negative connotation around unconscious bias is when we don't acknowledge it and learn how to manage it. So now I just want to talk quickly about the breakdown in the hiring process. When unconscious bias becomes a part of the hiring process, I like to call it the additional unwelcomed member of your search committee. When that happens, these are some things that allow the hiring process to break down. So job descriptions may not be updated regularly. They do not clearly define objectives of the position and are not inclusive. So is there anything in your job descriptions? This is, in many cases, your first contact with an individual. This might be the first time that they're hearing of your company or learning about your company. Does that job description properly reflect the work that that person would be doing? And is it inclusive? Does it have a mention of your diverse initiatives and that you welcome candidates of diverse identities to apply for the position? Generally, that is not a part of job descriptions. And one thing that can help as far as breaking down unconscious bias and generating a more diverse applicant pool is to make sure those positions are inclusive. Also, having the job descriptions updated is going to allow you to be more objective because you're fairly evaluating that candidate against the work that they're going to be doing every day and not factors that have nothing to do with their ability to do the job. Using a variety of sources. Are you using any diverse publications to share the opportunity? Search committees are not properly trained. So most people don't have HR experience, but they interview and hire people all the time. So does your company have any sort of professional development in place to help you with managing the hiring process, learning about unconscious bias and how to manage that, and making effective hiring decisions? The hiring objectives need to be clear to the search committee. Candidates are forced to interview with homogeneous search committees. So are your search committees reflective of the diversity that is within your organization? So certainly we know diversity goes beyond visual diversity, right? But sometimes that's the first thing that people see. In order to get to a deeper level of connection with anything related to DEI, that initial what we can see, sometimes people need to see someone who looks like them in a space in order to envision that they can be in that space as well. So making sure that the search committees are not homogeneous, not allowing personal factors to influence decisions. So skills, qualifications, and experiences need to be considered, not necessarily the fact that that person may have went to the same college as you or their kids go to the same school. All of those things that really, again, don't have anything to do with a person's ability to perform the functions of a job are related to some biases that we have. Biases aren't always negative, right? They can also be favorable. I'm in favor of someone because we went to the same school or we're a part of the same identity group. So we also need to realize that biases can be negative against people who have different identities than you, but they can also be favorable in the sense that that person has some similarity to you that is allowing you to make a decision to hire them. And then lastly, one thing I just want to share to kind of frame the conversation as I go through my research, which will begin on the next slide, is this is not a magic wand. When I'm going through this information, it is not to tell you that every single time that you post a position that you should be hiring a diverse candidate. The goal here is really, how do you generate a more diverse applicant pool? You have to start there first. If you're not producing a diverse applicant pool, you have no chance of increasing your diverse hiring initiatives. So that's really what we want to focus on here is how do we get a more diverse applicant pool? Ultimately, that allows us to increase our diverse hiring. So next, I'm going to talk through my research study. So if you can just bear with me a little bit, there's a lot of information here. When I get to the findings, I am going to read a little bit of information just so you can understand some of the experiences of the individuals that I interviewed. So just starting off with a quick literature review. Just want to talk about higher ed. That's the industry that I'm in. I know there's people here in quite a few industries, but the broader society, higher education and the broader society tend to reflect what's happening on the campuses of colleges and universities. So we know DEI initiatives, DEI work, DEI issues, racial issues, anything related to that, they've been a longstanding problem in our country. They've been a longstanding problem in higher education. So it's no surprise that this is now coming up as an issue around faculty and staff diversity as it relates to our student populations that are becoming more diverse, yet our faculty and staff populations are not. We have a very homogenous nature here in the US where people of common backgrounds come together rather than diversify. That's a contributing factor. And then just also realizing the value that having a rich, diverse environment provides for our college students as they prepare to enter the workforce, the global workforce that we're in now, where you have to learn how to work with, communicate, respect, value, understand, and be sensitive to all identity groups. Having that experience on their college campuses well prepares them to do that in the workforce. If we don't learn how to diversify, faculty and staff, we are denying students that experience. And so when they go to the workforce or the quote unquote real world, as many people refer to it, they have no experience with interacting with individuals who may not have different experiences or different identities than their own. So the next thing, more related to students and the demographic makeup of faculty. So students often cite concerns with faculty and staff diversity to improve on their college campuses. So if any of you are in the higher ed realm, if you read the National Student Engagement Survey, so the NESE surveys, or specifically, I have a community college background, the CESE, the Community College Student Engagement Surveys, you will see that this is a #1 reason that students are not being retained at institutions. Has nothing to do with the quality of your academic programs, has nothing to do with your student support services. It is how far does that student have to go to see someone who has an identity that's the same or similar to theirs. And again, we want to keep in mind that it goes deeper than visual diversity, but when someone is new to a community, that's the first way that they may connect. And so if they have 5 classes, they have an advisor, an athletic coach, they're interacting with 10, 20 people within the institution, and none of them share an identity that is the same or similar to theirs, they're likely to leave. They're not likely to stay at that institution. They're not likely to be retained. And unfortunately, they're not likely to stay in education. They may go and get a job and not even continue or matriculate to complete their degree. Only 16% of the nation's professors are minorities. The majority of those are teaching at HBCUs. So again, an issue for students who are taking multiple classes and may not have any faculty members that identify with them. And then just being mindful that the student demographic continues to become more and more and more diverse, especially as diversity initiatives, diversity recruiting initiatives, scholarship opportunities. Lots of colleges and universities now are really making an effort to recruit minority students. And that can mean a lot of things. It could be a first-generation student. It could be a Black student. It could be an international student. And so while we're working hard to get those students there, we need to make sure that we have the proper support for them on our campuses once they arrive. Search committees is often overlooked as a barrier to diversifying faculty and staff. How the institutional culture, basically, what do people get from your from the team of people who they meet? That's the face of your company. They're representing your company, and that candidate experience is going to ultimately determine whether someone wants to work at your company or not. So we need to make sure those search committees are properly structured. Again, visual diversity, diversity of experiences. So maybe newer employees combined with some employees that have some longevity with the company, varying areas within the company. So multiple functions and roles represented would make the best representation for your organization. And then test of unconscious bias has shown that people of all backgrounds, they tend to favor the group that they're a member of. So again, that's where that managing the bias piece comes in. Doesn't make you a bad person. We're not wrong. It happens to the best of us, but we have, because we know this happens, we have to do the work and we have to work at it, or else it'll continue to be a cycle. Unconscious bias of an organization is embedded into the strategic plan, how policies and procedures are developed. So if it's really a top-down approach, if diversity, equity, and inclusion is not a strategic value, or you don't have strategic initiatives around it at your organization, you may find it very challenging, and as an individual who's trying to implement some of these initiatives, because it is not supported. It really needs to be supported from the top down and across the entire organization. I had 3 research questions. They were, what are the perceptions of current hiring practices in higher education? How does unconscious bias in the hiring process affect faculty and staff diversity? And how can future training better prepare members of search committees to make more effective hiring decisions? I looked at this research through Schneider's attraction, selection, attrition model. So basically, his model describes the cycle that happens over time. Selection, it describes the process by which an individual selects someone who shares common attributes. So again, you have a homogeneous search committee. They select someone who has similar attributes or similar identities as them. That attraction is it for the need for someone who's in a particular environment to be in an environment that fits their personalities and interests. The environment does not. And so ultimately they leave in what Schneider describes as attrition. So this cycle really shows how someone may be hired into your organization, what their experience might be once they're there. And that attrition describes that when they decide to leave the organization. This cycle is one that is kind of dangerous to get on, if you will, of having, to continuously replace positions because you select someone for reasons other than they're qualified to do the job. So what this just really shows you is that behavior modification is extremely important to initiatives such as increasing diverse hiring or even implementing diverse hiring initiatives. And so this model just shows you that if you want to have a major change initiative, such as increasing diversity amongst faculty and staff or employees at your organization, it's going to require some behavior modification. In essence, we have to get off of this cycle, this continuous cycle that has happened with the hiring process year after year. Quickly, I'll just share some of the methodologies, procedures, and analysis of the study. So it was a qualitative study, phenomenological approach. I had 9 participants, which were human resource professionals and academic deans, all employed at colleges and universities in the Midwest. I used semi-structured interviews to understand their lived experiences with the hiring process. And then the participants were limited to human resource professionals and academic deans. So that's the limitation of the study, is that I only have that perspective. The findings of the study are in 5 themes. So their current hiring practices, the search committee composition, the fit factor, the effects of unconscious bias, and lastly, improving the hiring process. So this is where, if you can bear with me, I'm going to read a little bit just because I want you to understand some of the experiences of some of the individuals that I interviewed. So current hiring practices have created barriers to accomplishing diverse hiring initiatives and contributed to a process that is unbalanced, unfair, and unprogressive. This is exemplified through Schneider's attraction, selection, attrition theory, which explores some of the challenges organizations face related to diverse hiring. Schneider's theory holds that the people make the place, showing how the biases of professionals may contribute to issues around diverse hiring. One human resource professional expressed, quote, "In higher ed, some people, they tend to focus on factors less important to a candidate's ability to perform and more, focused on a degree and academic discipline. And unfortunately, race and age have come up in the discussion," end quote. Ineffective hiring practices have contributed to recruitment and selection practices that impact the standards and expectations of candidates, often leading to favoring certain groups over others. One human resource professional believes, quote, "We have different standards for different people," end quote. Another human resource professional described her efforts to ensure the hiring process is as fair and equitable as possible while being faced with the biases and challenges of hiring managers. Quote, "I, for example, had one hiring manager call to ask me if I could double check to make sure that an applicant is authorized to work in the United States. I had to explain to him that he, the applicant, checked the box that he does have the cause. There's a box on the application. Do you have the right to work in the United States? And he checked it yes. So unless you want me to call every single applicant and ask them if they have the right to work in the United States, I was definitely not going to call this one," end quote. The next theme is search committee composition. Despite good intentions stated in strategic plans, institutions struggle to create search committee structures which operate as intended. Schneider's attraction, selection, attrition theory illustrated this in the following quote, where a participant speaks on the composition of search committees and how they tend to function. Quote, in a situation where you have everyone that has similar experiences, similar backgrounds, their natural comfort zone is going to be to look for talent that mimics them. The similar to me hiring era is going to occur most commonly when you have those homogeneous groups. So if you're continuing that pattern, I think that's going to yield people that think the same, have been through the same things, and is going to lack creativity and innovation, end quote. The lack of structure for selecting search committees can also negatively impact the candidate experience. Candidates seek to work in an environment that fits with their personalities and interests, and where they feel their skills, values, and perspectives are welcomed. However, with unprepared and poorly structured search committees, candidates could be subjected to participate in interviews with homogeneous groups, people with whom they do not identify. Such instances may result in candidates of certain identity groups not being selected. One HR professional shared such an experience from a prospective employee. Quote, I know there was one time that we had an interview for a chancellor role where the candidate was an African-American female, and she went to one of our campuses and her interview panel was 5 white males. And though she did fine in her interview, she felt it important to let me know that it wasn't a good look for the college to have that kind of one-dimensional interview team determining whether or not she'd be a good candidate. And I completely 100% agree with her that we try to make sure we don't let that happen, end quote. The next theme is the fit factor. Many higher education leaders call to question the term fit, leading to thoughts and feelings associated with fit and if it provides an avenue to support hiring candidates who are similar. Further, the belief that fit is one of the most influential factors in hiring decisions, referring to Schneider's theory and his belief that the culture of an organization is important to consider the people driving the culture. If the employee group driving the culture is a homogeneous group, this regime will only continue, contributing to the lack of diversity, and there can be no increase in diverse hiring. One academic dean expressed, quote, one of the phrases that I hate the most whenever people think about hiring a candidate and they put together a very homogeneous committee is, they'll ask whether or not the person would be a good fit. Fit is kind of code. It's a dog whistle in that regard for, is this person going to be just like us? I think you unfortunately run across that a lot in higher education in the forming of those committees, end quote. The next theme is the effects of unconscious bias. So unconscious bias refers to individual biases we aren't aware of. They impact our understanding, actions, and decisions. One participant remarked, quote, when those biases are strong, they guide the decision-making. So someone who has all the requisite skills and experience can't move to the next round because somebody is saying, I'm telling you, when they come from here, this is what the result is. So that's going to limit the amount of diverse talent that's actually making it to the pool, end quote. As it relates to organizational behavior, one academic dean shared her thoughts on hiring practices and how the unconscious biases of search committee members can lead to negative candidate experience and unfair evaluation of potential candidates. Quote, well, I think it plays several roles actually, the most obvious being hyperscrutiny of minority and women candidates' credentials. Candidates who don't fall into certain categories are never questioned to the degree that other candidates' credentials are questioned, end quote. Training faculty and staff about unconscious bias is a crucial step to improving the hiring process. Further addressing challenges associated with search committee bias will require establishing clear expectations, explicit goals, and well-defined objectives for search committees. One human resource professional expressed, quote, it can certainly have a role in how each candidate is received and ultimately who is selected for hire. I think we all have to be better managers of our thoughts and perceptions and try to give each candidate a fair chance, end quote. And the last theme is improving the hiring process. So until factors such as unconscious bias, search committee composition, and fit are addressed, hiring trends may continue to follow Schneider's model. And the challenges associated with diversifying faculty and staff will likely remain. Participants expressed the importance of a willingness to assess diversity efforts openly and with an honest, in-depth evaluation of how diverse their campuses currently are, in comparison to where they'd like to be. One academic dean shared, quote, "So we can do a self-evaluation as an institution to see where we stand in these areas. Thinking about biases and prejudices, and that just actually happened. I think more targeted and intentional conversations should definitely occur because that being aware of biases and being culturally aware is something that I think everybody needs, not just for hiring practices, but just for everyday interactions, period," end quote. So thank you for bearing with me while I read through some of that so that you can understand some of the experiences of those that I interviewed. Now, based on the findings, I came up with some recommendations from my study, and these are the recommendations. So a greater involvement from human resource professionals with knowledge and experience with best practices for human resources. In most cases, I found in my personal experiences and with the individuals that I interviewed is the search committee is usually left to manage most of the process on their own. Human resource professionals are only involved in the very beginning of the process for more screening purposes. And they're not really a part of the process to make sure that the search committee is adhering to the objectives of the position. And so having that involvement from human resources almost as sort of a consultant as you go through the process to ensure that one, you don't have questions about, things related to human resource best practices or interviewing or how to effectively screen candidates, and that you're also sticking to the objectives. So again, that day-to-day work, what skills and qualifications does that individual need to do that position? Behavior modification, so we talked about that with Schneider's model. If you're going to engage in a major change initiative, DEI initiatives usually require behavior modification. And so behavior modification training focused specifically on overcoming unconscious bias. I know most organizations have individuals serve on committees to make hiring decisions, but I'm not quite sure that every organization, from my research, I know that all of those individuals did not have an experience at their organization where they were provided some sort of training prior to being asked to support a hiring decision. Shifting the focus to clear and timely position descriptions, avoiding subjective considerations such as fit. One thing that I would like to encourage everyone to do, if you can do nothing else, is to take the word fit out of your vocabulary when it comes to hiring. Fitting in, it doesn't necessarily give the best image of your organization to a potential candidate. It sounds kind of like high school at the cafeteria table in high school. Are you going to fit in there? What we're looking for are people who can make a cultural contribution to the organization. Their values align with the organization, and their skills and qualifications will allow them to successfully perform the functions of the job. So really thinking about it in those three areas, rather than thinking about fitting in, can really help how we make decisions. Increased transparency and better structure. So how are you selecting individuals for these hiring committees? I know I've been asked to serve on lots of hiring committees. I have an HR background, and just having a passion for this sort of topic and having my research focus in this area, I get people that ask me to serve on search committees, and I always want to know why. How is the position that we're hiring for, how does that position interact with mine? What experience have I had here, at my organization that would be valuable to this particular search process? So don't be afraid to ask those questions because you want to figure out why you're being asked to serve on a search committee so that we can be more intentional about selecting the right individuals and also making sure that there's some diversity there. We want to develop a well-constructed recruitment and selection process that is fair, equitable, and consistent. So that's loaded, right? That's going to take a lot. But we really need to be intentional about not just hiring, but having a consistent process that happens and that's followed every single time for every single position. And I don't think that happens in most organizations. At least it did not occur to happen with the individuals that I interviewed in my study. So that would be another recommendation that I'd have. Based on the recommendations I provided, I just wanted to share a list of actions that you might take to help support some of those recommendations. So again, using HR best practices as a professional development opportunity for faculty and staff. So maybe there's a yearly or annual training that individuals need to go through in order to serve on search committees. And you can offer a badge or a certificate. That way, employees have something to take away from it. They can also put that on their resume. And specifically in higher ed, as you move up in your career into administration, a lot of what you do is human resource based. So this would help individuals also to advance in their careers. Update job descriptions, use more inclusive language. Again, does your job description reflect any diversity initiatives that your company currently has? Does it welcome candidates of all identities to apply? Create intentional and transparent processes. We just talked about that. Really being intentional about why you're selecting individuals and making sure everyone knows why they're there and why they're a part of that search and how they can add value. Include a representative from human resources or a subject matter expert on each search committee, just to keep the process fair and objective. Encouraging individuals within your institutions or your organizations to eliminate the word fit from their vocabulary as it relates to hiring. Implementing annual bias training as a requirement for employees, including a diverse group of students. So this could be if you're at a higher education institution. Our students is a student-facing position, and would the perspective of students be valuable in the process and be another welcome perspective that can support your decision. This is one that I really like, that is really interesting and would make a good next study. Is anonymous hiring has become very popular. So certainly you can't do that for every position, but there are certain positions where you can remove all identifying information. Why do you really need it? It just allows for bias to occur in the decision making. So if it is a position where you can do that, maybe try assigning numbers to each application and having people review their materials in an objective way without knowing who they are or where they're from or what their address is, any of those things that allow bias to occur. Have a referral process. If you have diverse employees working for you now and they are great employees and they like working for your company, they're your best resource for finding other diverse candidates. So if you use those individuals to refer other applicants, or if there are specific affinity groups, so there may be women of color groups, or there may be groups for first generation students or employees working within an institution. So any of those groups can help you identify some diverse candidates. Having an assessment done of where you are with your hiring practices, I would certainly occur. I think that certainly should occur within your institution if that's something that is feasible. You have to determine where the breakdown is occurring. It's not occurring in the same place for every organization, but if you're struggling with your diverse hiring, there's a breakdown somewhere. Training subject matter experts. So having some people within your organization that are really experts on hiring and experts on your specific hiring process, and having them be a part of each search committee. And then establishing strategic priorities for each search committee to help them stay objective. So again, the job description, the department, and the goals. How are we making sure that we're evaluating each candidate based on that criteria? Lastly, I want to share with you some things to remember just from the content that I've shared today. The goal is to generate a more diverse candidate pool. It's not to hire a diverse candidate each time. So I always like to make that that determination just, so people understand that, I'm not coming with a magic wand with this research saying that each time you hire, it should be a diverse hire. I can tell you as a minority, no one wants to be the one that's hired because they're Black or because they're a woman or because they're first generation. So that's not what this is about. So we want to make sure that we don't get into that, because that just creates a whole new problem that then we'll have to figure out how to address later. But there are qualified candidates of all identities, and we need to do a better job of finding those when we have a position open. Every employee or member of your team is not in the same place with their DEI work, so you need to extend grace. If you're extremely woke and this is your thing, and you're, you know a lot about DEI, and you're really engaged in the work. If someone's new to this work, let's not judge each other. Let's celebrate the fact that there's an openness there, because being open is the first step to achieving a lot of these initiatives that we have around DEI. So let's extend grace to understand that everybody's not in the same place with this work. Let's understand there's no shortcut. You're not going to go from where you are today to meeting all of your diverse hiring initiatives in a few weeks. It really is a progressive process that starts with taking 1 or 2 steps and building from there. Being careful with the language that you use. So again, if I can't stress this enough, if there's one thing you can take away today is really to try to eliminate the word fit and the right candidate. Using those terms imply that you're looking for someone specific. And not just in skills and experiences, that you're looking for someone specific outside of those things. And so you want to make sure that you're not using those words. Small changes have a big impact. So like I just said, starting small with what can you do? Even if it's just today, you can say, I'm going to encourage individuals within my organization not to use the term fit. That's huge. It seems very small, but it's huge. So if that's where you can start today, and then how can you build from there? Hopefully getting to a point where you completely eliminate homogeneous search committees and that you're starting to see a more diverse applicant pool for your position announcements. Having biases doesn't make you a bad person. So just want to remind you of that. It impacts all of us, the best of us, right? All those of us who are engaged in DEI work, those of us who are not, we're all impacted by biases. Doesn't make you a bad person, but we need to be willing to address it and learn how to manage it. If you don't have an openness to do that, then your DEI goals and initiatives will suffer. In essence, you won't make any progress towards those. And ultimately, for those of us who are in higher education, for me, it's always students first. So this study, although it does not heavily involve students, I still think about if we get this right, this provides a richer, more diverse experience for our students. With me being in the career space, I'm always focused on how students can be career ready. What way to make students more career ready than to give them a diverse experience on their college campus so that they know how to communicate, work with, interact with individuals who have different experiences and identities than they do without bias. So that is the end of the presentation of the slides that I have. So I'm not sure if there are any questions. I'm happy to answer any questions that you all may have.
Yes, actually, we do have a question. Thank you so much, Dr. Boyd. Wonderful presentation. Thank you. And
Thank
awesome
you.
research. Really cool. We do have one question here. If you're in a more rural area where there isn't a lot of diversity in the community, what can you do to be more attractive to those who will help us diversify?
Sure. So one, I want to say, diversity, it may be that you don't have a lot of diversity in race or ethnicity, but you do have diversity in other spaces. So I would say to really look at what are some other ways that you can implement the diversity within your organization. So it could be someone with a different background, right? Maybe you always hire someone that has this specific background and they come into your organization to do this work, but there might be someone else with a different background who's unique, who's really trying to get into that company or that industry that can't get in because people are, kind of putting them into a box as far as their past experiences. So even looking at diversity of experiences, looking at individuals who may or may not be from that area. They may have different perspectives if they're living in the area now, but that's not where they grew up or that's not where they're from. But then also not being afraid to cast a wider net, right? Just because your position is in a rural area, does your company have a flexibility for remote work or a hybrid or, a combination of in-office? If you can go out 100 or 200 miles, you're likely to have a more diverse candidate pool. And if there's a hybrid option where someone only has to come to the office, ever so often, or they can work remote, that is another way to increase your diverse candidate pool. So I would say really just opening up to think about what are all the ways in which you can diversify. If you're limited in identity, what are other ways and other factors that might add to your experience? Is it a company that has a lot of employees with longevity? So maybe your workforce is an aging workforce. Maybe you need to bring in some younger, new talent, some fresh out of college individuals. I know we have plenty of wonderful, bright graduates at Maryville that we're always trying to get connected to opportunities. So maybe bringing in some younger, brighter talent to help come up with some creative and innovative ideas and help that aging workforce. So really just thinking about diversity in multiple ways, not as being multifaceted and not just really one way. I know, the visual diversity that we can see is hugely important because it's usually the first factor, but how can we dig a little deeper than that?
Wonderful, thank you. And we have another question here. For those that would like to implement those important recommendations, but with a lack of power/authority in the company or organization to formally make those decisions, did your research uncover any success stories that would be a path for change?
So I learned a lot about the experiences of the individuals that I interviewed, and what's happening at their specific institutions. There was one individual who shared that she had been with the institution for over 10 years. Had noticed some patterns in the hiring process at that specific institution. Even had noticed some things that she considered when she was selected, when she was offered a position within the institution that she was currently working for, that alarmed her, and almost made her a little apprehensive to take the offer. She ultimately took the offer and had been at the institution for over 10 years at this time. And was really struggling because the institution she was working for had no diversity initiatives. They had no diverse hiring initiatives. Human resources was like one person working in an office that was basically screening and sending the candidates that passed their screening test, quote unquote, if you will, to the hiring managers. And so it was very hard to impact change because, one, people were inundated with work because it's a smaller institution where you have one or two people doing the majority of the work in a department. She did mention that about 6 months or so prior to our interview, she had gotten a new dean. And had expressed some of her concerns as her new dean was kind of meeting with individuals. She had expressed some of her concerns to that new dean, who was really committed to trying to get the institution from the top down to support some more diverse hiring initiatives and take some action. And so, at that point, they had not, had any diverse hires of note. But she noted that she noticed some positive change with a new leader in place, who really understood what she was trying to convey regarding the diverse hiring initiatives, and someone who was a little higher up within her institution, who interfaced more with the senior level leadership and could hopefully create buy-in for those initiatives. And so she felt fairly optimistic about her organization's ability to move forward and make progress. So that is one specific story that I remember. I don't have anything. I wish I had something a little bit more solid to say, like I have this organization or this institution that like completely overhauled their process. But there were, some positive stories that I did get from those experiences. One thing to note is with the individuals that I interviewed, there was an openness and a willingness to do the work. And sometimes that's the best place to start, right? Is you need a group of people. Hopefully it's organizational or institution-wide. That's a dream world that doesn't always happen, but you need a large majority of people within that organization or institution to support it, be open-minded and willing to do the work. And so I'll say, if nothing else is a positive story, it's the fact that all of the individuals that I interviewed were open about their experiences and open-minded and willing to do the work, just really looking for the support from their institutions.
Oh, great. Thank you. Thank you for the question. Thank you for the answer. Really appreciate it. Don't have any more questions in the chat, but I do want to piggyback off something in your presentation, Dr. Boyd. In similar discussion, I heard one presenter say that essentially, kind of paraphrasing here, that culture can hold more weight than the process. So when we had good recommendations on the process, the culture that is being created, whether it's inside, professors that are looking for tenure and have to go through that process of the culture that's created there, or just organizational culture within in itself. You talk about behavior a little bit. Is that the same thing as changing the behavior? You change the culture, or those two separate kind of big issues that need to be addressed?
Yeah, so thank you for that question. So the behavior modification piece of it it applies to everything, because again, in order for you to have a major change initiative of any sort, not just diverse hiring, but any sort of major change initiative that your company is trying to undergo, is going to require some behavior modification. But specifically, DEI initiatives, whether they're related to hiring or anything else, require behavior modification. It requires us to think beyond ourselves and our experiences and really try to understand, be sensitive to, respect, value, appreciate the experiences of others. And so that behavior modification of, changing how you interact with someone who has a varying identity than you do, or understanding their experiences, even if it makes no sense to you, right? So that is behavior modification at the very most basic level. And so it's very difficult for me to see how any organization can make progress in this space. Again, any DEI space, whether it's hiring or, recruiting students into your institution, or, just improving the culture, or the fostering a sense of belonging for people who have different identities, to feel like they belong in your environment. All of that's going to require behavior modification. So I think depending on where the institution or the organization is, if you're able to do an assessment, or if you're able to identify where some of the greatest challenges have been for you and your organization as far as hiring, you can then have a better idea of what type of behavior modification is needed. And if you have individuals within your organization that are, I'm trying to refer to this in a positive way, that maybe are problematic, if you will, and you start to notice that this behavior modification that needs to happen for you to support these initiatives isn't happening with certain individuals, that's where you can really start to impact change. Because generally, you have a person in a position, or a group of people in a position of influence or power, that's allowing this regime to happen. And so how do we identify where the problem is? Who, unfortunately, the problem people might be? It might be people that we like, and, but again, we can't move forward and not embrace this. And so if someone doesn't have an open mind and they're not willing to even just start somewhere with this work, how do we eliminate individuals who are not willing to modify their behavior to achieve these goals?
That's a good point. Thank you for that. And I wanted to really appreciate that about the change of behavior. I think that's very important, the step-by-step process to do that. On behavior, I wanted to, you talk about the word fit and right person, the language. Could you elaborate, I guess, just a little bit more on what you mean as far as the language is concerned? How do you change the language as far as recruitment and hiring and interviewing? Is that something that you really found in your study, just specifically on the various forms of language that we kind of develop over time?
Absolutely. So I've had this come up in various experiences that I've had throughout my career. So I used to be in human resources for a large Fortune 100 company. I was very young, fresh out of college, in this position. And so learned some things about the workforce and individuals very, very early on in my career, which I'm thankful for. But I noticed it in the company that I worked for, even being, a new professional 1-2 years out of college, that the way that we were selecting people, something just wasn't right about it. And so even if people weren't using the term fit, that's exactly what they were doing. They were looking for someone who would be a good buddy for them to go to lunch with, or they were looking for someone who fit into what they thought, and not just, again, based on experiences, qualifications, educate, not just those things. They were looking for someone who they thought, fit into what they wanted for their department. So someone with maybe a specific identity, a certain background, so certain socioeconomic status, associated with certain social groups. So I noticed that very early on in my career in HR, that was an issue. As I moved on into higher ed, and I've been in the career development space, I work very closely with employers, lots of them. And so the very first thing that a lot of them will say is, yeah, I'm wondering if you have any students that'll be a good fit for our company. And I'm thinking to myself, yeah, okay, can we really eliminate this term fit? Because what does it say to an individual? So I understand what an individual who's already a part of a group means, right? You mean, will the cultural environment of where you are, will that person be able to survive and thrive in that cultural environment? You mean, does that person have the right skills, qualifications, and experiences to successfully do the job? You mean, does that individual value your mission, and are their values aligned with your core values? Internally, that's probably what you mean, right? So let's say that, because on the outside to a candidate, when you say fit, they may not know you mean those things. It may sound like to them that you mean fitting in the sense of like, okay, is this like a social group that I have to like have something in common with you to work here? That's not part of the hiring process. That's a bonus. If you find a friend, you know, a friend in your coworker, that's great, but that's not the goal of your hiring. And so I think let's just say what we mean here. We don't mean fit in. We mean someone who can, again, survive and thrive in that culture, someone whose skills and experiences, educational background is in alignment with the daily responsibilities and the overarching goals of that position, someone who is interested in the company and their mission, and whose values align with those of the company. So let's just say that, because there's no room for interpreting that in a way that can be perceived as negative. Fit, some people may not see it as negative, but some people might. And so you have to think about not only, you know, generating a diverse candidate pool, but who are you running away? Are you running away diverse candidates because of their experience with your company during the interview process? They didn't feel like they quote unquote fit in. And so I think we have to move away from those terms that are too open for interpretation. What do you mean by that? I would hope that you mean those things that I just described. And if that's what you mean, then we should say what we mean.
Gotcha. That's a wonderful thing. And we talked earlier before presentation, we kind of have started off with similar backgrounds as far as where we started off at. So I'm totally with you on that, the world that we came from before when we were young in our careers. So yeah, no, I get that, the language that's particularly used, particularly in different sectors of different organizations. So I really appreciate you, Dr. Boyd. This was a wonderful presentation. Thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you everyone for being with us. We'll have the presentation as well as the slides, as well as the slides on our website. It was recorded. It is recorded, and we'll have that information up for you later this week. Dr. Boyd, thank you again, and please reach out if you have any questions or anything like that. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much. Have a good day, everyone.
Thank you. Take care, everyone.